Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hollywood. In this podcast series, we talk about biological threats and the pop culture that they appear in. I'm J.T. O'Brien, Research Principal at the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, and I am here with the Commission's Executive Director, Dr. Asha M. George. Today, we'll be talking about the post-apocalyptic science fiction drama series, The 100, which is from 2014. We're going to discuss Season 1, Episode 10, which has a biological warfare component. The title of this episode is I Am Become Death, which is a obvious reference to Oppenheimer. Yeah. The 100 was developed by Jason Rothenberg, and the series is loosely based on a novel series of the same name by Cass Morgan. And this episode in particular was directed by Omar Mata. So for the premise of this, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I think it's important to note what the premise of this series is. So the series is set 97 years after a nuclear war wiped out pretty much all life on Earth, or all human life. And the only known survivors were people who were up in space. They were people, there was a bunch of different space stations, and once they saw what was happening on the ground, they came together and formed what is, in the series is known as the Ark, which is basically they believe they are the last humans alive based on what they saw.
And I will say one thing that's interesting about that is right now we have one international space station.
Yeah.
And there's talk about other countries creating space stations. And the United States has had some kind of issue with that. Although I don't know why we think it's such a horrible thing to have other people putting space stations up there. But regardless, there's already conversation about other countries doing that. And I do think that it's interesting. Those other countries are Russia and China in particular.
Right. And we excluded China from the International Space Station.
Yes.
Initially when we first built it. So
for this series, though, the space stations that were left or were up in space were from or built by the United Kingdom, America, Australia, Canada, China, Japan, India, Russia, Venezuela, France, Brazil, and Uganda. And out of those, the United Kingdom, the U.S., Canada, China, Japan, India, Russia, and maybe France have
space programs.
Active space programs that we know of.
Yeah.
Maybe the others do too. Australia might. I don't know. I just haven't heard of anybody.
Yeah.
They haven't put anybody up that I know of on somebody else's mission. Anyway, so it's interesting. It's not completely disaligned with where we are right now.
And the other interesting thing about this is kind of the political structure that emerges on the Ark.
Okay.
It's very authoritarian, I would say, where you commit a crime, doesn't matter what the crime is, you are executed. Doesn't matter if you were stealing, if you murdered somebody, you're gone.
Yeah, I think
and they call it floating. So they have this term instead of swearing.
Okay.
They say, go float yourself.
Oh, wow.
Instead of... Because that's what they call it when someone's executed, because they're basically sent out into the vacuum of space. So they're floating.
Okay.
So they call it floating.
Understood.
That's their method of execution.
So...
but children under the age of 18 cannot be executed. They're instead sent to prison.
Okay.
And known as delinquents, juvenile delinquents.
So I think it's important to tell our listeners that you have seen the entire series, or at least up to this part of the series, whereas I only watched this one episode.
Correct. Yes. So. And on that note, there will be spoilers for season 1 and
beyond. So if you haven't seen it.
So if you have not seen it, we would recommend that you do so before continuing this podcast, or if you don't care, that's fine too. Okay, but do you think that people have to listen to all the episodes before this one to get something out of it, or do you think it's okay to do what I did, which was just listen to this one or watch this one episode? I think it's okay to watch this one episode, especially if you're only interested in the biological warfare components.
Okay.
Then you can just watch this one episode, just knowing what the premise is, and why it's happening. Then I think you'll. What did you think? Did you think you got good enough information out of it, or the biological?
Well, I think you provided enough about the premise to now understand some of what was happening. You know,
Right.
if you just watch that one episode, you're like, okay, why is this particular age group the only age group of people that are on this planet?
Right.
And is it Earth or isn't it not? You know,
It is Earth.
it's hard to tell right off the bat. Even with the recap, it doesn't
tell you that much information.
And you do kind of wonder about who are these who's the enemy and what's happening.
Yeah.
But you've provided enough about the premise. I think it's fine.
But let me give you a little bit of context about the enemy as well.
Okay.
So these 100 kids were sent down to Earth early. Initially, they were supposed to be in the space station for 200 years. That's when they thought that the nuclear fallout would go away and that they'd be able to be safe to go to the ground.
Okay.
But for some inexplicable reason, they are running out of air and resources at year 97. And they...
Okay. Well, you know, being resource
but they thought
limited,
they were good for 200 years, and then someone realized that they were not. So that's when they were like...
How did that happen?
Somebody screwed up.
Yeesh.
Somebody screwed up bad.
Okay.
That's 100-year difference.
Yeah. Okay. So now there's...
So somebody screwed up.
Okay.
And it's a last-ditch attempt to save humanity, is to send these kids to the ground to see if the Earth is survivable. So that's what they do. And they get down there. The Earth is survivable. They say the reason for that is because they experienced a lot of radiation in space, so that crosses over to the radiation that's on the ground. So they're able to survive it.
Oh, okay.
Which is an interesting explanation. I'm not sure if that's how it works.
Okay.
But they get to the ground, and then they realize there are people on the ground. They thought they were the last humans alive. So there are different, almost tribes or clans that are on the ground and they survived in different ways. So the grounders are the main people that they first experienced. Those are people who are just kind of adapted or have adapted to it.
Do they look different? Are they mutated or anything?
No.
Okay.
No, they're not mutated. So there are mutations. There are mutations in their blood.
But how did they create progeny with that much radiation? Wouldn't that have killed off the ability to have kids? Unless they were protected under the earth or, you know, behind a shield somewhere or something.
Yeah, so it's explained later on how this all...
Okay, all right.
How they all
don't
started.
Don't explain it. It's okay. It's okay.
But it does come up later how the grounders were able to survive.
Okay.
So there's the grounders, which are broken up into different tribes and clans. There's another group of people called the Mountain Men, and they are people who are basically have been living in a bunker for the past 100 years. And then there's another group called the Reapers, which are basically grounders that the Mountain Men have captured and given them a drug and turned them into like these crazy cannibals. Okay.
So 2 questions.
Yeah.
First of all, from this point on, do you think there will be spoilers? Do you want to finish your spoiler alert?
There will be spoilers.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Second of all, for the Mountain Men that are in the bunker, do you think they were military? Or some of them were military? Or former military?
Well, since it's 97 years, none of them. Maybe the early generations were, but 97 years is...
Well, so the reason I'm asking is this episode has something to do with biological warfare, and some of the language that is used is very military.
Yeah.
We'll get to that later, but one of my questions about this whole premise was how do they even know the tactics? Why would they know the language? You know, the phrase actually is softening the battlefield. How do they know that?
How does Clark know that?
How does Clark know that? How does anybody know it? Really, any of those people. So But I was thinking for the people who engaged in the biological warfare, they knew enough to say, we're going to use this for this particular tactic for this particular purpose,
Right.
which was to soften the battlefield, and no teenager all by themselves is going to say soften the battlefield.
Right.
So I was just wondering, where is this militaristic language coming from?
So I think that comes from the Ark.
Okay.
People on the Ark did have, knowledge of the before times, and probably a lot more educational resources than anybody else had.
I think
Clark's mother is also the chief medical officer.
Okay.
On the space station on the Ark.
I think
so. She's kind of been trained.
If we are extrapolating from what we have now, with our space program, Earth's space program, the military, all of our military branches, or most of them, have space programs.
Yeah.
And on a lot of these missions, we don't necessarily make a big deal about it in the press, but a lot of times we have military folks that are going. They're part of the mission. So it seems possible to me that they, with all of this going on, and you have 12 different countries putting space stations up there.
There's some competitiveness there.
And it's just possible that military space people were up there doing whatever they were doing before the whole nuclear war thing happened.
Right, and that could be a reason why the society on the space station got so draconian.
My theory, it's possible, but my theory about that really is...
you had to put down an iron fist.
I think that happens when you know that you have... I don't think it's about bringing people together.
Yeah.
I don't even think it's about just regular human survival. I think it's about resource constraints.
Yeah,
I think when you get that constrained, you cannot have people going rogue for anything.
For any reason.
For any reason whatsoever. You cannot have it. And so they just came down on everybody. That's my theory.
I think you're right.
Given what you've said about the premise, that they're resource constrained.
Right.
So much so that they've just lost 50% of the time they thought they could be up in space in the Ark.
Right.
And are willing to risk sending
their children
down. And do they explain why they're sending teenagers versus adults?
I think
it's not that, though. If they're sending the delinquents.
Exactly.
Okay.
They're not sending the kids who have not been charged with any crime.
So they're
only sending the kids who have been charged with crime. So
interesting
basically,
ethical issue here.
Yeah. So basically, everyone is expendable if you commit a crime, and then they hold the delinquents until they turn 18. But once you turn 18, you can still be executed. So they are expendable
in their society they've created. Okay.
Yeah, but they don't want to go too far as to killing children, but they'll wait until you're 18.
Okay.
So so they are considered expendable. And another reason is, these are 100 people that we can send down to buy us some more time. Because those 100 people are using oxygen, they're using resources, so they could buy themselves more time by sending them
now,
down
do they have,
as well. So
we won't spend too much time on this backstory, but do they have communications back to the Ark?
When they reached the ground? They did.
Okay.
One of the characters, Bellamy, he snuck on the Ark because he was 18 and was about to be executed. So he snuck on board. And once they hit the ground, he was worried, if they tell the Ark it's survivable, they're going to come down here and they're going to kill me. So he destroys the comm system.
Oh, gosh.
Yes. He destroys the comm system to the Ark. So then there's no...
So the people in the linked space stations, the adults, everybody up there, they have no idea what's happened to this landing team.
No idea.
Okay. And how far out are they in space? Meaning...
Not that... probably within the space station's orbit.
Okay, so...
Our current space station's orbit.
You really, you couldn't build a big fire or something to signal them.
Yeah, no. I mean, there are things that they do try later on, because Raven Reyes is one of the engineers. And I think she tries some things, and they do eventually establish contact again.
Okay.
But at this point, it's basically 100 kids sent to the ground within, I think, the first or second episode.
Okay.
Comms are lost.
And we think by this time, due to a variety of circumstances before this episode, there are no longer 100 of them, right?
Correct.
There's less than that.
There's less than that, because a few died in the landing because they were screwing around while the thing was landing, thinking, oh, yeah, because you're falling to the Earth's surface and you're in, like, 0G, so they took off their seatbelts and were, like, floating around and impact. And so a few died there, and then a few died from grounder attacks. A few died from some other things. So there's less than 100 to start with. So there's not, less than 100 to start with.
Okay. Just trying to get an idea of the population we're talking about.
Yeah, trying to give all the context behind kind of how... Because I think like that context is important because it gives rationale for a lot of the decisions that these kids are making, specifically Clark and Bellamy, who have kind of taken leadership roles in the society, and why it seems like, why are they so cutthroat? Why are they saying, oh, we'll kill him if he is a problem? Or, we'll take these, significant steps to, because that's kind of the society they grew up in. And yes, while they're on the ground, they're trying to make a better society than what they had up on the Ark, but now they're threatened with their survival again by these people who are already on the ground. So you have a lot of competition, like it's almost like mini nations or mini countries kind of that are, so you have like these people who just came from the sky who are now trying to take over land that the grounders have been inhabiting for the past 100 years.
Right. Okay. All right. So just going forward with the plot then.
Yeah.
Let's do that quickly. It starts out with somebody that was a character earlier on.
He was excommunicated.
Pushed out of the camp, but then he's returned and he's bloody and he's tortured, and it looks like he has been infected, right? Or do we know that right then?
We don't know that right away.
Okay. But she gets sick. Clark
once she gets sick, she kind of figures it out. Yeah.
And also he gets kind of...
He gets sick too, I think, yeah.
Okay, and very early on in this episode, they somehow figure out that it's a viral hemorrhagic fever, correct?
Yeah.
Without a diagnostic test.
And
with her teenage
medical... I mean, she might be specifically, like, people might be trained for specific roles on the Ark.
Yeah.
And with her mother being the CMO, she might have been...
Yeah.
Like, she is kind of like the on-site medic as well. So she might be able to recognize a viral hemorrhagic fever, but it's a very broad skill set to have.
Yeah.
To be... For one person to have that much medical knowledge and... scientific knowledge, especially at that young of an age.
I appreciate they were trying to be scientifically accurate.
I'm glad it was at least a real-ish.
Yes, disease.
Like you and I, I'm sure, could tell when we were watching it. Oh, this is a viral hemorrhagic fever.
Yeah. Well, so what happens is Clark and others begin to start bleeding from their eyes and bleeding from elsewhere, I think.
Yep.
And they do develop a bunch of symptoms. I don't know that I would necessarily have said it's a viral hemorrhagic fever so much as I would have said it's something horrible like Ebola or, whatever.
But Ebola is a viral hemorrhagic fever.
I know, but I'm just saying, like, if I were a teenager,
if you were a teenager,
I don't know that I would know, the terminology.
Right.
But I do think that when this guy Murphy is returned to the camp, Bellamy wants to kill him, like, immediately, right? Which is in keeping with what you said about what was happening up in the Ark. But Clark doesn't want to do that. She thinks he might have valuable information about the grounder people.
Yeah. So from an intel perspective, what do you think about that?
I think that is interesting. It's an interesting notion. But again, we have a problem with this series in that if these people were adults,
Do you think they behave differently?
I don't know that they would behave differently, but if they said something like this, then I think an adult would have a better notion of what interrogation takes,
Right.
what it would take to get something out of somebody. How do you figure out whether somebody is telling you the truth or not telling you the truth?
Right.
I think you have a more developed idea of how to, especially if you're a parent or an interrogator, to catch somebody
in a lie.
You know, they say something, you keep conversing with them, and then they say something else that contradicts the first thing, and then you know. That's how many parents have, figure out that their
Right.
kids have done something. But for the teenagers, I mean, she's right. He might have valuable information, but I don't know how they would know, even if they get information out of him,
That it's true.
that it's true. We had this problem, when we were going after Osama bin Laden, all the Al-Qaeda interrogations and the questions about what was going on down in, in our Guantanamo, but interrogation places
Right.
everywhere. We were employing methods that, if you are an intelligence person, like I was, you are told and you are trained, those kinds of extreme measures that almost amount or do amount to torture don't necessarily get you the truth.
Right.
They get you somebody telling you
Whatever the person
something,
is willing to say.
but they don't necessarily.
Whatever the person is whatever they think they want you to hear.
Yes.
To get you to stop.
To get you to stop.
Yeah.
So, there are a lot of questions about this, whether it's a good idea or not. And you'll notice we haven't heard a lot about that kind of interrogation for quite some time.
Right.
It's just not. It's not something that is ordinarily used. Not to rag on our colleagues in the CIA or DIA or anywhere else. It is a tactic that you employ once you get more and more desperate. Mm-hmm. We're not able to collect a whole lot of information through standard means on a lot of our enemies throughout the world. It's just not that easy. And
Right.
putting, someone that doesn't look like everybody else and doesn't speak the same language as everybody else, that's just not something you can do anymore. Gone are the
Right.
days of the James Bond guy going somewhere in Europe to collect information. That is a whole, that is realistic. That is not realistic today.
Right.
We cannot do that. And I don't think we have enough people that are good enough, look it enough, and can speak well enough to fake it. Although, I'm sure we do. We have a bunch.
Right.
But anyway, not to get off on that too much. I think that I think the notion that he might have valuable information is true.
Yeah.
He was captured and then he was sent back. But
And if they just tortured him, you might think maybe he doesn't like them. Like he's willing to.
well,
But he also got.
they're also assuming that he was tortured just because of the way he looked.
Right. Yeah. That is true.
We
The
don't
reason he was
know.
excommunicated was he's still bitter about that, and you see that later in the episode when he ends up killing.
Yeah, but how does
Somebody else.
why does he get excommunicated in the first place?
Because
He did something, obviously.
Somebody died. It was actually like the leader of the Ark's son who was sent because he committed a crime. He was sent down. There's no one's getting saved by having a person in high power on the Ark. Mm-hmm. So he gets sent down. People don't like him because his father has floated a lot of their parents.
Yeah.
And
he's autocratic.
it's the kid.
Well, the father.
The father. But they don't like the kid because of the sins of the father. Mm-hmm. So, people are ragging on him and really don't like him. And there's this one little girl. She couldn't have been older than the age of 9. Mm-hmm. Both of her parents were floated, and somebody, and she's having a really hard time being around him because it's a reminder of his father and who killed her parents.
Okay.
So John, I think it might have been John Murphy, or no, it might have been Bellamy, who was trying to console her and be like, hey, like, you know, it's okay. And the message got misconstrued to the point where she went and killed the father's son.
Okay.
The leader's son.
Okay.
And then Murphy gets blamed for it.
Okay.
Because Murphy's parents were also sent, so they thought that he had done it, and he's been a little, you know, off. And they were about to hang him.
Okay.
Until the girl finally spoke up.
Okay.
And then everyone wanted to kill, like, he kind of led a charge to now kill the girl.
Okay.
And everyone was like, well, that's not okay. You can't do that. So that's why they ended up excommunicating him.
Okay, got it.
So it isn't clear whether or not he's on the same side.
Right.
But
that would be
bitter.
the point. We have no idea. We really don't know anything about him. I mean, they don't really know. They don't know what happened. They don't know really who he came in contact with. We don't really know why he's behaving the way he is. We don't know anything.
Exactly.
So, but I would say between these, you know, you got Bellamy on the one side saying kill him, and we've got Clark on the other side saying no, we should keep him alive for whatever purposes. I think they probably should have made a decision somewhere in between. I personally would never have trusted him, even if he was completely squared away. If he was indeed tortured, we don't know what mental state he's in. We just don't know. We don't know anything.
Like, people can be, you know, Manchurian candidate, turned kind of thing. Not that that's ever been, I don't think, as far as we know, successfully implemented it, but gradations of that have certainly happened, I think.
Yeah.
Where someone,
okay,
you know, but yeah, so
that's the big instigator for this episode, right?
Right. So Clark starts bleeding from her eyes, so the incubation period is unrealistically short. Because it seems like it's within
like a couple hours, maybe.
Yeah, a couple hours. She starts bleeding, and then it starts rapidly. The virus within hours starts, like, people start bleeding from the eyes, coughing, dropping, vomiting out blood. So she ends up setting up a quarantine. Her and Bellamy do.
But they're quarantining in a tent.
Oh yeah, no, it's not an effective
so we don't have any indoor air quality. We don't have anything.
Nothing. Yeah, no, the quarantine methods were woefully inefficient. Yeah, I think.
But the idea of separating people who are sick from people who are not is a good one.
Yes, but they still have. There's enough room for cross contamination. I think, you know, very clearly. Well, they weren't.
Points. They didn't put the quarantine tent in like one place and then really, really, really far away were the rest of them, which you understand because they're a relatively small group, and if they were to be divided like that, that's actually just a death sentence for the people who are in the quarantine area because they're all sick anyway. Nobody can protect them. But I think also for the other group, too, now you're reducing that group by that many people. Right. Like, you know, the total number of people. And that means it's a smaller group trying to defend itself against all these other entities that are running around the planet. Right.
And how far can you spread out before you start getting attacked by the grounders?
Right. And how far do you need to be separate anyway from the viral hemorrhagic fever?
Right.
You know, I don't think our 6-foot rule applies in this situation.
Yeah. Especially, like, so I think, especially in that situation, you might have an idea that it's a viral hemorrhagic fever, but you're not going to know exactly what it might be. Same thing with, like, COVID. Yeah, we knew it was a coronavirus, but we didn't know it could spread asymptomatically. Yeah. When it first arose. So they're like, with all the radiation and everything, you have no idea what this thing can do.
But then, so they decide, right? They assume then that Murphy was, at some point he becomes sick himself.
Yeah, so I think Octavia, who is Bellamy's sister, she is friends with a grounder.
Okay.
His name is Lincoln. And I think she finds out from him that it was sent by the grounders. Right. She basically finds out that they're planning to attack the next day.
Right. Well,
and that's how they make the connection.
He's the one that says, it was done to soften the battlefield.
Right.
So the thing about softening the battlefield, what meant by that was they were not trying to kill everybody. That's not softening the battlefield.
That was not the plan. Yeah.
So that is killing everybody. That is a separate thing.
Right.
But softening the battlefield in this context has been discussed before. It is the idea of releasing a disease in whatever way into a country or an area or a population such that the disease reduces the person or the people's immune systems or immune function, or it makes them just ill enough to sort of incapacitate them
so they can't
temporarily so that they can't fight or they cannot fight as well.
Right.
And then the other people who released this disease in the first place, who have immunity against it,
right,
presumably, can sweep in and take over. And one of the advantages, I have to say, of softening the battlefield, other than just being able to take over without as much loss of life, potential, or at least your own as the enemy, your own loss of life, is that it is presumed to be able to to keep critical infrastructure intact, right? So you're not bombing anything. You're not, putting corrosive chemicals onto stuff that's, burning through metal or whatever. You get to keep the critical infrastructure. And frankly, for people who consider this, to the extreme, you may not even care if the people are dead or not, because you want the critical infrastructure.
And I do think there is an asymmetric warfare component to this as well, because the grounders, as far as I can remember, I don't think they have firearms.
Goodness.
I think they might have bows and arrows. They might have swords or axes or things like that. But the kids, they have firearms. So there is an asymmetric.
That's really
advantage.
Interesting. Yeah.
So the grounders are basically using asymmetric warfare tactics to soften the battlefield, and then if they die, great. But if not, it's going to make it easier for them to take over that camp.
So, but I think that is interesting too, because it means that the grounders have seen this disease come and go, so they know enough about it. They know what the mortality rate. They know that people recover from it sufficiently. At least some do. They know enough about it to be able to deploy it, but
it's a very crude method of deployment. But
right.
I think I've said a lot. It's one of the ways that's just the easiest.
Yes, to put it in a person, provided that person, if you care at all about ethics, that provided that you think that person can survive, and Murphy does survive.
And Japan did this against the Chinese during World War II.
Did they? Mm-hmm. Did they send people in?
Yeah,
that were diseased?
They would infect POWs with plague and then send them back.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right. Well, so clearly I need to go back and look at our graphic novel on the history of germ warfare. But so they're doing this. They're softening the battlefield, and Lincoln tells what's her face, Raven,
or
Octavia. Sorry, Octavia. He tells her that they were softening the battlefield, and that they were planning a traditional attack,
right? A traditional
for the next day.
Yeah.
So again, it also shows that they're not like a bunch of crazy people. These are people
they're smart,
who are thinking
they're we know the incubation period.
We know the incubation period. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to go and control these people. We're trying to possibly take whatever it is that they have. We don't know. We know their resources are limited, but the grounders may not know that.
Right.
Yeah. So, so then he asks her to leave with him, right? But she refuses, and she goes back to the camp.
Yeah.
Okay. So then we get back there and we see a few people dying throughout the course of the episode. As a viewer, you see maybe three people die, but we found that there were more.
Potentially,
away.
Because at the end of the episode, there are 14 graves that you see.
But we really don't know. Is that a graveyard from before? Is it,
so it's hard. So somewhere between 3 and 14 people could have died.
We should go back and look, because if were those all 14 of the graves fresh? Because if they were all fresh,
right,
then it would be 14 period. That died.
Period.
But so we were.
But there was also a death because Murphy killed somebody.
Right, and you said the first there were a few kids that died in the landing.
In the landing, and then some others that had died and spat between the grounders.
Okay, but for this, we thought there were probably about 60 kids alive.
Yeah.
At that minimum. before this biological attack, and then we saw at least 3 people die.
Right.
So that gives us a 5% mortality rate. Mm-hmm. But it's probably higher if we're going all the way up to 14.
Right.
That's that takes us up to 15%.
Right.
Right. Which is probably not, depending on the viral hemorrhagic fever, that's probably not unrealistic.
Yeah, I don't think it's unrealistic. I think what's unrealistic is the transmission rate.
Yeah.
Viral hemorrhagic fevers don't spread that. Well, first, they don't spread that quickly, but they also don't spread that easily. You have to come in contact with the bodily fluids. Yeah. In some way.
But
I guess if there was a pre-symptomatic period, then it's possible.
Well, I think that's possible, but you also didn't you say that there's a theory that the fever, this virus, had mutated because of all the radiation?
Yeah, so I was thinking, there's 2 theories for how this virus could have come about. One is natural, in quotations, from the radiation. Mm-hmm. The other is that it's something the grounders found. Because if there was a nuclear exchange, it might be believable that there could have been a biological weapon that they had found, but they're in the United States, so that makes me think that's less plausible. And they're near D.C.
Interesting. So maybe
that's why the guy's name is Lincoln.
Maybe it released from Usamrid.
It could have.
Or they found it.
Yeah.
In Usamrid. We have no idea whether Usamrid has underground facilities that might have survived a nuclear holocaust, and
Well, even think about the Reston virus.
Yeah, but that came over in monkeys.
It did.
Right? So if there was a nuclear holocaust, one imagines that monkeys would die if they were out there.
They would not make it.
No. So that's interesting. I didn't really realize they were in the D.C. metro area.
That's why the grounder's name is Lincoln. Is because the grounder camp that he's from, I think, is based around the Lincoln Memorial.
Huh. Interesting.
So, in one episode, you actually see it.
So now, did you watch the entire series?
Yeah.
Is there somebody named Sam for Usamrid?
I don't know. There might be.
We don't know.
This was the most obvious connection. He's called Lincoln.
But are there any more of them? Is there Jefferson? Is there?
Not off the top of my.
Washington.
Indra is the leader of Tree Crew, which is the grounder tribe that they're most most interacting with in this season. And she's the one who I think is confirmed in a later season ordered the biological attack. I don't know if Indra is relevant.
It doesn't sound. We don't know. We'd have to look at all the monuments here in this area.
In this area, but I think the grounders clearly have their language is very clearly derived from the English language. Mm-hmm. They can speak English as well. Yeah. They don't reveal that.
Okay. They don't reveal it in this episode. They just run around quietly.
Right. But they're based around D.C. The D.C. metro area. So they have these monuments. You see imagine seeing the Lincoln Memorial after a potential nuclear. I don't think it would be there. But
Yeah, but isn't it, I think this is just, I mean, this is so off topic,
yeah.
but okay, they named this person Lincoln. First of all, it means that everybody can read.
Exactly.
The grounders can read.
Right.
Which, okay, you know, it just asks or begs all these questions about, okay, where were they?
How did
they
start?
survive? But I guess, you know, if they were somewhere during the nuclear holocaust where they were protected and they survived, and it makes sense to me that there would be people there who would say, okay, well, we can't just leave a bunch of people uneducated.
Right.
We have to teach them to read. We don't teach people to read just because we do that.
Because it preserves
it preserves that, and we have to write things because they don't have computers and stuff.
Right.
After the nuclear holocaust, we assume. So okay, so then we find out that Bellamy and some guy named Finn and Raven decide they're going to destroy a bridge that I guess the grounders were going to come across to attack.
Yeah.
Our group of people. But then Bellamy falls ill, and then something else happens, and Raven gets sick, and some other guy has to get involved. And while all this is going on, they found at a crash site, because they saw, I think, didn't they see like a shuttle or something come out of the Ark and land and crash land?
Yes.
Conveniently again. Within walking distance of their camp in the United States.
Right.
But they go over and they find hydrazine, which they determine is very easily and highly explosive.
Right.
So they're going to use that to destroy the bridge, which, once again, I will point out, they're destroying critical infrastructure, which I don't know that I agree with. But, okay. So stuff happens. Somebody manages to finally fire a shot that conveniently, again, is enough to spark the foil sitting on top of the thing, and the bomb, and then it does explode, and a bunch of grounders go flying up into the air.
Right.
But one imagines they didn't get them all because they weren't all on the bridge.
Exactly.
In fact, when we see the shot that's taken, they're just beginning to cross the bridge.
Right.
If you were a true military person, you would have waited. If you could have. But they didn't really have...
Well, because it was under pressure. Who's taking the shot?
And they didn't have wiring and stuff.
It was somebody that had to...
They had to shoot it, which is about as old-fashioned as you get, short of somebody standing there and, like, striking flint or, lighting a match, which still would have been a little ridiculous in terms of the hydrazine.
Yeah, the hydrazine thing, it was a little ridiculous.
But it's okay.
But it's okay. Yeah, we can suspend disbelief for that.
Well, I think they should just have called it something else.
I mean, you could have called it nitroglycerin.
Anything.
You didn't have to call it hydrazine, which is also not red.
Right.
As it's shown, it's colorless.
But then in the end, okay, so they blow up the bridge. And then basically the next scene you see is everybody's kind of back at the camp and in this short period of time. So this is very short disease presentation. People, either these kids died from this fever, or they have already recovered. They're a little weak, but they've already recovered. Right. And there's no more bleeding from eyes and stuff. So that's when we see the 14 graves. We have some conversations, some chit-chat about what was supposed to happen and what did happen. And then I think we end with Murphy going over and killing somebody in the quarantine tent. Mm-hmm. He by now has been quarantined because he too is sick. Yeah. And doesn't he do something else? He kills somebody and then he does something else.
Oh, I'm trying to remember.
Maybe not. He might just do something dramatic.
I know he kills that guy because he's mad at him for the whole thing that happened before.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure what else he does.
I think that he was just sent over there to do the softening of the battlefield.
No, yeah, he wasn't sent over as an agent. I don't think.
I actually think he was sent over for an additional purpose, not just because think about it. The grounders knew They know about this disease.
So they might have known.
They know what the
survive.
incubation period is. They know what the symptoms are. They know how long the symptoms last. They know what the mortality rate is. They know what the morbidity rate is. They know all of that stuff. So when they sent him in, they knew, they had to have known there was at least a chance that he would survive that, carrying the disease and spreading the disease. If they knew that, he wasn't just sitting there. And he wasn't just begging to come back. He was going about doing some other things. So we don't know whether he's just sort of nutty, because you said he was kind of nutty to begin with.
Yeah.
Or whether the grounders said, if you survive this, then go do some other thing. Collect some information or do something. And then if you come back and give us that information, then we'll treat you like one of the grounders. You can live. Yeah. We don't know, and we don't know.
They just knew he was figured out. Like, this guy's a wild card. Send the wild card.
Right.
Back.
Well, there's a theme running through this show, from what you're telling me, of sacrificing people who, in the case of the Ark, they've committed a crime. Perhaps in this case, they're sacrificing this guy because he's mentally unstable anyway and not useful to them. We don't know, but there's a lot of sacrificing, intentional sacrificing of other people for things that we, at least as a society, would never do. So it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's decisions made in later episodes where, it's a question of killing. I think I want to like killing. Do we kill this amount of people? Or do we let ourselves all get wiped out?
Yeah.
So even after they've expelled the 100 to the surface, back up on the Ark, there's a situation where, the oxygen's getting really low, and they have to do a culling, essentially, of more people. And they're trying to figure out, do we tell them, let people volunteer, or not? And we just do it. Eventually, a decision is made to let them volunteer, which was good, and people do volunteer.
Okay.
But it was like 300 people or something on the Ark that had to volunteer.
It's interesting, though. There's all of that going on. We have a lot of ethical questions about this. Yeah. And the ethics, of course, of intentionally infecting somebody with something and then sending that person over into another camp.
Yeah.
But what I do think is good about that scenario is that we talk about the potential for that scenario a lot. And I'm not convinced that we have planned adequately for exactly that scenario. We have decided as a society that we would never infect somebody, purposely and send them somewhere else. But I don't think we're taking into account, the extremes to which people will go, especially if they believe a bunch of garbage that they've been fed, probably in a religious context, to say, if you do this, if you sacrifice yourself, then X and Y will happen for you in heaven, or X and Y will happen for you, period. I don't think we,
or even like a motivator, enough. Like your children will get to survive, or your family will get to survive.
Convince them that you're doing this for the greater good.
Yeah.
We need to bring these people down, or soften the battlefield. We want to soften the entire United States of America, so let's spread this disease. They didn't do particularly well with West Nile fever. They didn't do particularly well with Zika. They didn't do particularly well with COVID. They didn't do particularly well with influenza. And so let's just ratchet it up a little bit. You go do that. You get us the entire country. And then we can just go in there and take over. Yeah. That's not to say that
it's
you go from
scenario.
0 to 60 like that. There are a lot of steps in between those diseases. Of course, they all took time to spread, and they weren't all equally deadly.
Right.
But so that there's time. There's time for our own military to intervene before somebody necessarily attacks with a different kind of conventional ability. But I think it's a scenario that is worth considering and worth planning for.
Yeah.
I personally think we need to do a better job with our biodetectors, not just our environmental biodetectors, but also our, indoor kind of air detectors.
Yeah.
We heard at our recent commission meeting on July 25th that ARPA-H over at the Department of Health and Human Services is, really leading forward into the indoor air quality arena, and they're talking about this, identifying
going as far as detection. Integrated into
pathogens and integrating that into, which makes sense, right? Why,
why not do both?
While you can, why not? So I think that is, it's an important thing to keep in mind, but not just for, buildings. I think we need to have better detection systems for biological agents in particular, not just at the airports where everybody's like coming in and out, but also I would like to see all of this now at the gates and in the airplanes, and anywhere we have, at least where we have an air quality thing.
Issue.
It is a security issue.
You have one person who comes through with that. They're coming through with they could come through with one person can not carry anything on the plane, and come through with something that could be the equivalent of a nuclear weapon, in the form of a biological weapon.
Yeah. And so I think we need to expand upon these kinds of scenarios.
Yeah. And honestly, the Ark should have had.
Well, but they might.
Like that.
Well, it might have been incorporated into the Ark.
They might have wanted to keep the equipment on board.
Right. Well. I mean, there's a lot of. Again, we're back to sacrifice. What are you sending these kids down with? I would imagine, given what you described, that and what little we do see, we do go up to the Ark on. I think.
Yeah.
On this one, just a little while, but I think. 100 years has gone by practically. Who knows what's still functioning? They don't have the resources to replace stuff. They can't. I doubt they have like a massive manufacturing capability anyway. And if they did, what resources are they drawing upon to create new filters and new pieces of metal equipment as it wears out?
Right, because they're not at the point where they can send off to like the moon and go and mine.
Right. Not that we know of.
Not that we know.
Not that we know of.
It does not seem like they're at that capability.
Right. So, and then where's the mining equipment coming from anyway if it's not already there on the moon? And so even if it is on the moon.
Materials.
Yeah, so it's but it is this scenario is a good one just in terms of not so much the teenagers and all of that, but somebody being infected and being sent somewhere else. As you pointed out, it has happened historically and in relatively recent history. Yeah, and it could certainly happen again. So I think there's that, and we talk in our reports about planning and strategies and that kind of thing. The United States used to have. And probably still does have these 15 national planning scenarios, and everybody was supposed to plan for all these different things. And I think there were a few that were biological at the time. I remember hearing about them, a couple of decades ago. So cross our fingers. Hopefully, people have continued along the scenario-based planning, route. Yeah. But I think there are other things in this episode. I think were really good in terms of considering biodefense. Clearly, for example, this teenager group, probably all the groups, they don't have anything in the way of biosurveillance other than waiting until somebody dies, which bears a remarkable resemblance to most people's countries' biosurveillance, including that of the United States. We can detect some stuff pretty quickly, but we are waiting until after something happens in order to detect it. Right. That is what surveillance is. It's after the fact. It's not before the fact or even during the fact, like with a biodetector. Right, exactly. So I think it's an important point. I think so too. How much would surveillance have helped them in this situation? Well, I mean, given how quickly. Technically, they had pretty good surveillance. Like they picked up on it really fast. Now, of course, the disease helped because it was,
it was very
suddenly
visually
bleeding from the eyes and stuff. What if it had been flu-like symptoms, which so many of these diseases demonstrate?
Transmission.
Asymptomatic, or a bunch of asymptomatic people and a bunch of people with flu-like symptoms.
For all we know, they all got it.
Yeah, we don't know. You're right, we don't know. And we don't know where we are with immunity either, as has been demonstrated with COVID. Just because you get COVID doesn't mean you're immune from COVID.
Right.
But I think that collecting information and collecting data and sharing it, that goes back to recommendation 31 of our blueprint, the most recent blueprint for biodefense. It's still valid, even in this crazy case where nobody has equipment and computers and all of that. You can at least pay attention to your own group, which is what they did after the fact. But I would hope that they say, okay, this has happened, so now we should be on higher alert. It could happen again. And also, we don't know what's going on with this disease. Now it's here. Is it going away? Is it going to burn itself out of the population?
Right, exactly.
We don't know. Reflecting back on what happened with COVID, remember the early theories were, it's a disease like any other disease. It's just going to move through the population and it'll be gone.
Yeah.
And we didn't decide that here in the United States. We kind of quickly said it doesn't seem to be behaving like that. But remember, Sweden tried to gut it out.
Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah.
They didn't want to make anybody be locked down or do anything.
Because there was this whole theory. I forgot about this. I must have just removed it from my memory. There was this whole theory that if you let it burn through the population uninhibited, it'll be fine.
Right.
Like you'll get herd immunity is what the term was.
I think too, Sweden, remember, the Vikings came out of Sweden, and I think there's still some genetic attitude there that, the strong will survive and the weak will not.
Right. And
we'll just move on from there. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's a bad policy. What I am saying is the virus did not cooperate with this policy. Theory.
Yeah.
And it just sort of hung around. So there was no virus moving through geographically and going somewhere.
Right. It wasn't like a wave of water.
Right.
That crashes into the shore and then recedes and then you're done.
Remember what happened with Zika? Zika in our hemisphere. Well, it started down at the bottom, down in the bottommost part of Central or South America, and then moved up, and we watched it, and we watched it, and we watched it, and then it moved through the United States. And I don't know that it ever did anything to anybody up in Canada. So there was an impact of temperature, but it behaved like that. Nothing else seems to be behaving like that. So there's no real point here other than to say that they needed some biosurveillance. I hope in the show they institute some biosurveillance and pay more attention to what's going on with people. I also think you asked about the intelligence aspect of this. This screams, now that it's happened once, which I disagree that should be our national policy, that we wait for something to happen and then implement.
And then do it, yeah.
But in this case, they're kids. They don't know any better anyhow, and it has happened.
Right.
So now that somebody's been sent over that was infected with something, you have to assume that it could happen again.
Right.
So somebody needs to collect some intelligence in general, but in particular, they need to be collecting some intelligence on this biological intelligence.
Right.
What do they have? What do they know? We're pretty sure that nobody's got any laboratories, but we don't know that. We don't know where these grounders are coming from.
Yeah,
what if they're all sitting up in Fort Detrick?
Yeah, exactly.
We have no idea. But these kids, as adult as they are, I think they need to generate an intelligence collection plan and a policy on it. And
they have Lincoln.
They have Lincoln, so they have a source, at least one source.
At least one source. And then maybe a policy if someone gets captured.
Right, and are we going to take them back? That is a great point, JT.
Yeah.
What happens if they get released? What are we doing? There are other movies about this too. Remember Red Dawn? Both Red Dawn movies. They don't involve intentionally infecting someone with a biological agent, but both of those girls are. Here's another spoiler for everybody. They wind up being surgically altered, right? So they insert like communicators or something in a location, LoJack. It's a location thing because they're trying to find this group of another group of kids.
Right.
So that refers back to recommendation 5 in our blueprint. I think we do talk about maintaining and updating a national biodefense strategy.
Right.
Our first blueprint for biodefense in 2015 recommended the creation of a national biodefense strategy. President Obama signed that off into law, but it was Congress, by the way, to give credit where credit is due. The Armed Services Committee on the House side is the one that picked up that recommendation and put it into the National Defense Authorization Act. It went off, it kind of got, that provision was rejected at first, but then it went back to the White House. Obama signed off on it, but it was the Trump administration who produced it for the first time. And then the Biden administration came along and added to it, modified it, and then also tried to add more to its implementation plan.
Right.
For these kids, I mean, everything is national, I suppose, for them, but they need a strategy now. They have to say, okay, there's a possibility that this could happen.
Yeah.
So they need a strategy, and we have to keep our national strategy up to date with any intelligence and, quite frankly, any imagined scenario that anybody can come up with to make sure our strategy and the operational and the tactical plans that flow down from that will address what's going on. If you look at what happened with, I think it was H1N1 back in 2009.
Yeah.
The Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, put out a national strategy for pandemic influenza in 2004, and its very comprehensive implementation plan in 2005. So there were some things already in place, and there were folks in the White House who were calling and managing the federal government and trying to, keep them on track to be prepared. Now, here we are again with influenza. Don't know if anybody's using the old national strategy for pandemic influenza, and there doesn't seem to be a new one. But for any of our listeners that might be in the current administration, I highly recommend they go and look at that.
Yeah.
But one thing I want to say about the old strategy, I always credit them, as you know, JT, for having done that. But the scenario they used for that influenza was that influenza was going to arise in or near China. But that influenza did not arise in or near China. It arose in, there's debate as to whether it started in Mexico or in the United States in Texas.
Geographically, they're basically the same.
Basically the same area. Sorry, everybody who would like to pretend like there's a hard line there.
There's a hard line.
Because there never is for disease. So, I think that was a failure on their part. Yeah. They should have taken into account some more scenarios and made sure that the strategy would do that, because what they wound up doing was focusing everybody's attention over there, and meanwhile here comes a disease exploiting our vulnerabilities here in the United States.
Right.
But that that's recommendation 2 now from our current blueprint for biodefense. One of the things I said to you when I was watching this show was immediately I thought, wouldn't it have been nice if these kids had a diagnostic test?
Yes.
Not necessarily for this very specific fever, because how could anybody have predicted that? A thermometer, some kind of diagnostic test. But I think like a broad spectrum diagnostic test.
It seems realistic nice. For the time. You have 12 space stations.
Yeah. They need them up there too. That's the thing.
That's fair.
You know. So we talk about this in recommendation 29. of our blueprint for biodefense. But I think more importantly, you were instrumental in writing our 2020 report on diagnostics for biodefense. It's really, really important. We do not emphasize it enough in this country.
Right.
When you look at the stockpile and you look at what BARDA and HHS, I guess just in general, and the USDA, everybody's wanting to jump in on antibiotics and antivirals and vaccines.
Yeah.
And then the therapeutic stuff to, after something happens, we could use this to treat people.
And that's great, but we need to go farther left of boom.
Yeah.
We need to...
Or at least at boom.
Yeah.
Right?
At boom.
And be able to manufacture and produce this stuff. It's a huge lesson from every single pandemic, outbreak, and epidemic we have. Every single time we have something like this, people are like, oh, too bad we don't have any diagnostics. So
COVID being the most glaring example of a total and utter failure by the U.S. to, it was 3 months or something along those lines, 3-4 months where we just didn't have any situational awareness.
Yeah.
That's why the report is called Flying Blind.
Yeah.
Because that's basically what we were
flying
doing.
blind.
Yeah, we were flying blind.
And even now, if you look at the diagnostic situation and biosurveillance, I know we're trying to improve both. We're not ragging on
doing better.
Our government and everybody else's government. People are trying, but in terms of budget allocations and just attention, resources, etc., we're not putting enough towards either one of those. So if you don't have good biosurveillance and you don't have good biodetection, environmental or outdoors or indoors, and you don't have diagnostics, then you're waiting around for what I call the human sentinel system to erupt.
Yeah.
And then you're waiting for people to get so sick that they're going to hospitals or maybe to doctors' offices, and they're showing up, and then people start saying, we don't know what this is.
And you have to rely on an astute clinician.
Astute clinicians and laboratories.
Thankfully, Clark was by some
miracle. By some miracle. So there's that. I think, for me, there were two more. I'll just run through real quickly. One is, it just really struck me. Well, let me say, I have two of them. One is that it was clear, we say, recommendation one of our blueprint, both of the blueprints from 2015 and 2024, is that someone needs to take charge. Now, we are talking about the nation, the whole,
right.
As a nation, somebody needs to be in charge. And because we have so many, all the cabinet departments and 9 independent agencies and 1 independent institution, right, all have responsibilities for biodefense, and one department or agency cannot tell another one what to do. They don't have that kind of authority, unless we're under some military situation in which DoD can to a certain extent. But otherwise, HHS cannot tell, for example, given what's going on with our avian/bovine influenza right now, they can't tell USDA what to do, and USDA cannot tell HHS what to do either.
Right.
But because of that, we thought the White House should take over, should take charge. There's debate as to who that person should be. In our first blueprint, we recommended that it be the Vice President of the United States. In the more recent blueprint, we recommended that it be the National Security Advisor, delegating that to a deputy. But right now, we have an Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy. Then we have something in the NSC for biological defense, and it's just kind of all. We have the Homeland Security Advisor, floating around in there. The Domestic Policy Advisor. It's still not clear,
right?
And it needs to be clarified because we keep having large-scale disease events occur that affect our national security. Even if we say we don't care about anybody else.
Right.
It keeps happening.
Happening to that, yeah.
And we need somebody to take charge. But on this much smaller scale, with this TV show, Clark basically takes over. She takes charge.
She takes charge.
At least of all the quarantining and all that stuff. And she is a leader in that group, in addition to Bellamy and whoever else.
Yeah.
So, that's good. I think that if she hadn't, then they would have had a whole bunch more people die.
Right. More infections.
More infections. Well, and the grounders would have come in and probably
would have wiped
them all away.
Yeah.
So there's that. And the last thing I wanted to talk about before you launch into your part, there's a part where one of these kids puts on a spacesuit in this episode. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what she was doing. I can't remember if it had something to do with this biological threat or if it had to do with the hydrazine.
I think it might have been the hydrazine.
But as I was looking at it, I was wondering, are spacesuits, and would that kind of spacesuit be protective against extraterrestrial or terrestrial organisms? How would you test for extraterrestrial, without the actual organism? How would you know if it was protective?
I think extraterrestrial is almost impossible to tell. Terrestrial, though, I think it's more than enough.
But okay, so I'm just sort of go back in time when we were putting people up in these space stations.
Yeah.
Right. One of the things that our commission is concerned about, and you in particular are concerned about, given your background and your doctoral work, is defending against astrobiological threats. We call that astrobiodefense. And we've been looking at the Office of Planetary Protection at NASA, and we think that it should be authorized because it hasn't been yet, but yet they have authorized the Office of Planetary Defense. As for our listeners, the Office of Planetary Protection is the one that's supposed to, among other things, address bio. And we worry about contamination of other worlds, but we also worry about bringing stuff back and contaminating our world,
right,
and not just with biological stuff. But that means if we're worried about that, given the scenario as we see it in this show, you do not want an astronaut going somewhere, keeping their suit on the whole time, have that suit not be sufficient, not provide sufficient protection, and then have some extraordinarily long incubation period, or have that disease kind of go dormant inside this person,
and then it presents,
and then come back to Earth or the moon or wherever they're going to be, and they finally take off their spacesuit, and suddenly we have disease floating around all over the place. So I think it's an interesting question we should pose to NASA at some point, because I'm 100% positive I'm crediting NASA and all the other space agencies for thinking about that.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure that they definitely are thinking about that. And I think this also raises another interesting point. All of those kids, their immune systems should be pretty bad from being up in space.
Yeah.
Their entire lives. So I'm wondering if that had an impact on their susceptibility to the virus.
And maybe the grounders didn't actually send over what they thought
was that bad?
A viral hemorrhagic fever.
Yeah.
Maybe they just sent over, I told you, or when we were talking earlier about the softening the battlefield stuff. Even now, there are diseases that people theorize could be used, like aflatoxin.
Mm-hmm.
Or is that aflatoxin? I'm probably not getting that right, but whatever it is, that could be used, could be weaponized, and then used to just slightly lower immune system so that everybody's just too weak to do anything. So maybe that's what they thought they were doing, just sort of making
giving
people
them a light virus.
And no big deal. A no big deal virus that just sort of reduced their immunity they didn't need it forever. And we're assuming that the grounders want to come and destroy them all, but maybe they don't.
Right. Maybe they wanted to try and let's get them down and see if we can go make peace.
Well, I don't know about that, but maybe let's get them down and let's go get something they have, get something they're sitting on top of, force them to become part of our group, whether they want to or not. Maybe they need labor, maybe they need women,
or
weapons. We don't. You told me that this landing group had weapons, but the grounders do not. So it could just be about firearms.
Yeah.
Know-how, knowledge. These kids are coming most recently from the space station, whereas everybody else has been sitting around on Earth during a nuclear holocaust and coming out of it. Maybe, these kids, as demonstrated by Clark and her exceedingly large medical, background, they just know more. And the kid, the one that goes off and identifies the hydrazine, nobody else knew what that was, but she did because she's an engineer, the daughter, I suppose, of an engineer. So I think this that's quite a lot of recommendations. That
is. Do you want to jump into the ratings?
Yeah, let's do the ratings.
All right.
I mean, unless you have other recommendations you think we should.
No, I think you touched on all the ones I was thinking about as well.
Okay. All right.
But I think, those are all, a very interesting episode. I think it just, especially in such a short amount of time, addressed a lot and had a lot of, I appreciate that they, it was a viral hemorrhagic fever, so they took something from real world.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, the quarantine was set into place and they had the softening the battlefield terminology and the method of delivery, I think, was not something that a lot of people usually think about when it comes to biological weapons.
Yeah.
Usually when you're learning about bioweapons and like when I was learning about them, one of the arguments that people say for the reason they haven't been used that much is because it's hard to make a delivery method, which I have always disagreed with.
Yeah.
You don't need a dispersal system like you do with a chemical weapon. It can be just one person.
Yeah.
Or, multiple touch points.
Yeah. Of course, there is the question people always raise as to, well, if that's true, how come nobody's ever done it?
Still, yes.
And I would say...
Doesn't answer that question.
Number one, we don't know that it hasn't happened. You came up with a historical reference, but we don't know that it's not happening right now. It just hasn't happened to the United States that we are aware of, first of all. And then second of all, even if it has... Considering the state of our biosurveillance, et cetera, we wouldn't necessarily find out. And even if we did suspect, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
We don't have a good attribution apparatus here.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
Unless
it was sentinel, like the anthrax letters.
And in this situation, unless one of these kids was like the child of an FBI agent in the hazardous materials response unit or something. So, okay, well, let's rate it.
Okay, let's go through it.
Okay.
Relevance to commission recommendations. What do you think?
I think I gave this one. I gave it an 8 because it seemed like we hit on a bunch of them. It doesn't mean that they were doing a good job addressing the recommendations, but there were a whole bunch of them that came to mind. You think that's too high?
Well, we're going on a scale of 5, right?
Oh, are we?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll give it a 4.
I'll remove this part. Yeah.
No, it's okay. You don't have to remove it. 4.
4?
Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think it does that. Scientific accuracy. I mean, there are things I just have to ding it for.
Okay.
The really fast. Then who am I to say after 100 years of radiation how fast an incubation period could be? Hydrazine thing is definitely not realistic, but
I gave it a 2.
Yeah.
Actually, I kind of gave it a 2 because it wasn't wholly inaccurate. You know, it's not like they stood there and said, "Oh, look, these people have allergies. That's why that's why they're bleeding from the eyes." They did accurately say it looks like it's a virus. They do use the proper term for hydrazine, even though hydrazine is colorless and
not that flammable
or explosive,
sorry,
right? It's neither of those things. But they used something that would be possibly in a spaceship.
Yeah, definitely.
I gave it a 2.
Yeah, I think a 2 is fair. I can't quite bring myself to bring it to a 3, so I think 2 is a good spot.
Let's say a 2.
Scenario development, I would say a 4 or a 5, I think. Because it's interesting because it's... It's a cool scenario, especially with all the context behind it.
I would say... I would give it a 4 because...
A 4?
to give it a 5 would be to say...
Yeah, no, you're right.
You know, it's kind of
It's
pretty
perfect.
much there.
Yeah.
And it's not. There are too many things that just didn't make sense.
Right.
At least we should take a point off for not paying enough attention to actual facts.
Yeah.
You know, and these are easy things. Somebody could have looked up hydrazine easily, and they could have called NASA to be honest, and said, "Is there anything else
Right.
that we could use in this situation?" Or JPL, I'm sure would have been
they would have
happy to
answered the
say, "Yeah,
question.
there's this and that." So I say a 4. Let's give it a 4.
Okay. Entertainment value. This is going to be hard. I'm going to abstain from this one because it's hard for me to judge it because I've seen the whole show.
Okay. Well, I gave it a 3.5.
3.5. I think that's fair.
It was interesting, but I was glad that it was an episode. It wasn't an entire movie,
Right.
Dedicated to this. But there's more to it than just the bio part of this that counts as far as entertainment value.
Yeah.
And to me, you know, this is again one of these situations where you have teenagers or actors who are supposedly teenagers but blatantly not teenagers,
Right.
and acting in a very adult way and speaking in a very adult way, and that's not their fault. They had to. That's how they were, you know, that's how it was written, and that's how they were directed, and you know, we have all the reasons that the entertainment industry has to use older
Actors.
folks.
Yeah.
But so I think it held my attention. I thought it was good. I thought there were some interesting parts. I didn't get bored.
That's good.
So if you don't get bored, I think you get a 3, and then you go out from there.
Yeah. Okay. 3.5 sounds fair.
Okay.
Success of the imagination or creativity.
Do you have to abstain again for this one?
No, I mean, I'm trying. Like this one, I think it is creative. Just given this, like the context of how it happens, I don't know. I'm feeling like a 3, maybe a 4.
Really?
I don't know because I feel like they could have gone a lot further. Why were you thinking?
I was thinking I gave them a 4.5. I don't know if
4.5?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, I thought it was pretty imaginative.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily accurate, but it was imaginative.
It was imaginative.
Yeah.
So you want to go with 4?
Let's go with 4.
Okay.
Okay.
Next, you have shock or surprise value.
I gave him a 1.
Yeah, that's a 1.
Because once you have the initial, oh my God, they're bleeding from the eyes, that was kind of it.
That was kind of it.
What else was surprising about it?
You expected him to make the shot at the end. It was pretty,
you know.
Yeah, run of the mill. So yeah, I would agree with that. Government policy.
I gave them a 0.
0.
Because there isn't. First of all, there's no government.
There's no government. It's
and
just kids
second of
running
all,
the place.
you know, there's no policy. I don't think anybody's. That's such an esoteric, you know, societally oriented thing. I said 0. Plus, you know, what policy we do have is, you know, autocratic decisions to kill people immediately.
Yeah, no, they're not. It's not good policy.
Yeah.
Anyways, the policy.
What
that's
policy
there.
they do have, and
Yeah.
So I gave it a 0.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's how it was written. I don't want to say that they wrote it badly. I want to say that the way they wrote it shows that there is no government policy.
Right. There is no good government policy.
Yeah.
Portrayal by the actors. I have to admit, I do remember when I first watched this, I was not impressed.
This episode or the whole series?
The whole series. I mean, not the whole series. The first season. The acting got better as it went on. I think. Maybe 3.5. What do you think?
Okay.
2. I don't know. What do you think? What did you
Well,
get?
I mean, the thing is, it's part of a genre.
Yeah, it's like the young adult.
Yeah. So you have to put it there.
Yeah, put it in
Because
that
they would have
context.
been given specific direction.
Yep.
So a lot of the angst and the romance and all that stuff
All the
is just
extra.
specific to that category.
Right.
Which I think they did fine. They did that part fine. I think even though the writer got the hydrazine piece wrong,
You can't blame that on the actor.
that's not the actor.
Yeah.
I mean, they did what they were supposed to do. It was supposed to be an explosive. It was supposed to be highly explosive, easily explosive. And with the disease, I don't know, they all just had to act like they were diseased. I thought they did a good job with the throwing up. People were throwing up, and the makeup in terms of the bleeding from the eyes. You didn't have kids just standing there nonchalantly bleeding from the eyes. They looked like they were in pain. So, yeah, go ahead. What do we say? 3.5? 3.5?
3.5.
Give them a 3.5.
3.5. Okay. Direction?
I gave him a 2.
Yeah. I think it could have been better.
I think that a person, a human being living on this planet right now, would know better than to have a quarantine section right next to all the other people who are not quarantined. Especially if you're separating just by burlap in a tent. I think they made decisions to make it be more dramatic and exciting that just didn't feel like it would be realistic. Stuff on the bridge and it was also, by the way, like a small bridge.
It's a small
bridge. It was like a big deal.
Yeah, like they could have gone around it probably.
Yeah, now I know they were probably resource constrained. All these shows are, but I give them a 2.
Yeah. Production value and production.
What do you think?
I feel like, trying to remember what we see this episode. I think like the representation of the disease, that production was well done.
Okay.
I think when Murphy came back looking all bloodied up and tortured, I think that looked well. The set really isn't that complicated, I think, in this episode.
Yeah.
I imagine. I mean, there was the spacesuit, and I'm guessing she was in some kind of. She might have been in the dropship that they came in. So I'd give it a 3.5 maybe, or
okay.
Yeah, 3.5.
Let's give it a 3.5.
I can't give it a 4.
Okay. What's the average? Wow. Okay. Well, I think if it's a 2.75, it probably got pulled down by the 0 we gave and the 1. But, they scored pretty high in some other categories, and I guess it makes sense.
Yeah, and it's one episode, so it's one of many. It got an 8.1 on IMDb.
Okay, well.
Which I was surprised by. But the show is actually pretty highly rated.
Hey, look, it captured our attention, but we're asking for other things like relevance to commission recommendations.
We're not like Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah. So good. All right. 2.75. 2.75.
Well, thank you all for joining us on this episode of the By Hollywood podcast, and we hope that you will join us next time.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.